Hello, students! In this explainer today, we are going to dive into one of the most important years in European history, the year 1848. This was a time when the entire continent was shaken by revolutions. You can think of it as a perfect storm, a combination of hunger, powerful new ideas, and the dream of building modern nations. All right, let's look at our agenda for today. First, we will try to understand the very difficult conditions that led to the revolt. Then, we will explore the new ideas of the educated middle classes. After that, we will take a very close look at the Frankfurt Parliament. We will also understand why it failed, discuss the important role of women, and finally, we will evaluate the long-term legacy of these revolutions. So, we begin with the first and most basic cause, the widespread suffering of the common people. Before any new ideas about nations or constitutions could take hold, it was simply hunger and hardship that pushed the peasants, the artisans, and the workers to their breaking point. Now, as you can see in this picture, the situation was very, very tense. The 1830s and 1840s were decades of immense economic difficulty all across Europe. This wasn't just a simple protest. This was years and years of quiet anger that was finally boiling over into open revolt. Now, what is very important for us to understand from this slide is how several different problems all came together at the same time. The population was growing very fast, which meant there were more people looking for jobs than there were jobs available. People left their villages and moved to cities where they lived in terrible, overcrowded conditions. Small producers like weavers found it impossible to compete with cheap goods made by machines, especially from England. And in the countryside, peasants were still suffering under the burden of old feudal dues. To make everything worse, bad harvests caused food prices to shoot up. It was really a recipe for disaster. To properly understand just how desperate the situation had become, let's look at a specific example: the uprising of the weavers in Silesia in the year 1845. This event really shows us the day-to-day reality of the workers' struggle. A journalist of that time named Wilhelm Wolff described the scene. He wrote that the misery of the workers was extreme. You see, because so many people were desperate for work, the contractors who supplied them with raw material and then bought the finished cloth kept paying them less and less money. The workers were being badly exploited. And this is what happened next. The weavers marched together to the contractor's big house to demand fair wages. But instead of listening, he threatened them. In their anger and frustration, they broke into his house. The contractor ran away, but he came back the next day with the army. The result was a tragedy. 11 of the weavers were shot and killed. This was not a revolution for ideas. It was a revolt born from hunger and a deep sense of injustice. Now let's move to our next section and see how this situation develops. Because at the exact same time as the poor were revolting out of desperation, a very different kind of revolution was being planned. This one was not led by starving peasants, but by the educated middle classes. And it was a revolution of ideas. So, the crucial point to remember for your exams is that two separate movements were happening in 1848. One was the revolt of the poor people and the workers, which was driven by economic hardship. At the same time, parallel to this, there was the revolution of the liberals, people from the educated middle class, like professionals, businessmen, and teachers. And what did they want? Well, their demands were political in nature. They wanted to unite the many small German states into one single nation. They demanded a constitution, a government that was based on a parliament, freedom of the press, and the freedom to form political groups. Theirs was a fight for modern political rights. Let's pause for a moment on this very important term, a constitution. What is a constitution? It is essentially a rulebook for the country, a set of basic laws that even the king, or the monarch, must follow. The liberals believed that a constitution was essential to end the absolute, unchecked power of the monarchs and to create a fair and just government. This was a very radical idea for that time. These liberal demands for a constitution and a unified nation, well, they reached their peak in the German regions. It was here that they attempted a grand experiment, the creation of an all-German National Assembly, which we now know as the Frankfurt Parliament. This image you see captures that truly historic moment. On the 18th of May, 1848, 831 elected representatives from all across the German-speaking regions marched together to the Church of St. Paul in the city of Frankfurt. And what was their mission? It was to write a constitution for a new united Germany. So, how did this all happen? Let's look at the steps. First, members of the middle class formed various political groups. Then, they organized elections across all the German states for a national assembly. From these elections, 831 representatives were chosen. They all met in Frankfurt and began to draft a constitution. Now, their plan was not to get rid of the king entirely. Instead, they wanted to create a constitutional monarchy, a system where the king's power would be limited by a parliament. This was a moment filled with great hope and excitement. But, as we are about to see, the Frankfurt Parliament did not succeed. So let's now dive into this and try to understand the reasons for its failure. This was the critical moment, the turning point. The Parliament offered the crown of this new, united Germany to Friedrich Wilhelm IV, who was the King of Prussia. But he refused. He rejected it. Why? Because he would not accept a crown that was offered to him by elected representatives of the people. He believed in his divine right to rule. After rejecting the crown, he joined with other conservative monarchs to crush this liberal movement. So, why did it all collapse? Well, the old powers, the rich aristocracy and the powerful military, were strongly against the parliament. But perhaps the biggest weakness came from within the movement itself. You see, the parliament was made up mostly of middle-class men who ignored the demands of the workers and artisans. Because of this, they lost the support of the masses. And without that broad popular support, the liberal movement was simply too weak. In the end, the army was called in and the assembly was forced to dissolve. There was another serious problem within the liberal movement. It was a major contradiction that really weakened its moral authority. And this was its attitude towards the rights of women. This slide shows the debate very, very clearly. On one side, you have a liberal politician, Karl Welcker. He argued that a woman's natural place was in the home under the protection of men. But on the other side, you have an activist like Louise Otto Peters, who argued that liberty must be for everyone. How can you demand freedom for yourself, she asked, while denying that same freedom to women? This was a deep conflict within the idea of liberalism itself. And this image shows the result of that kind of thinking. Women had been very active in the entire struggle. They had formed their own political associations and attended many demonstrations. But when it came to the Frankfurt Parliament, they were denied the right to vote. They were only allowed to attend as silent observers, watching from the visitors' gallery high above. This really shows us the limits of the liberal vision in 1848. So in 1848, the liberal revolutions were defeated and the conservative monarchs returned to power. But does this mean that it was a total failure? Let us now examine the final legacy of this very important year. This slide perfectly illustrates the two different outcomes of 1848. In the short term, yes, it was a clear failure. The liberal movements were crushed. But if we look at the long term, it was actually a surprising success. The monarchs realized they could not simply turn back the clock to the old days. To prevent more revolutions in the future, they began introducing reforms. Major changes, like abolishing serfdom and bonded labor, were implemented in the years that followed. And the crucial point to take away is this. The experience of 1848 taught the old rulers a very valuable lesson. They understood that the only way to maintain their power and prevent future uprisings was to grant some of the changes that the liberal nationalists had been demanding all along. The fear of another revolution actually forced them to modernize. This leaves us with a final important question to think about. While the revolutionaries of 1848 did not achieve their immediate goals, their ideas did not die. They planted the seeds that set the stage for the unifications of Germany and Italy, which would happen just a few decades later. So we can say that, even in defeat, the revolution of 1848 shaped the future of Europe.